Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Never Mind the Dam Busters, the podcast that goes beyond aircraft and operations to explore the people, decisions and consequences behind RAF Bomber Command. I'm Jane Gulliford Lowes and it's wonderful to have you with us once again. For this episode, I'm flying solo again as James is unable to take part, but I'm delighted to be joined by a guest whose work many of our listeners will already know very well. Sean Feast began his career in journalism in the mid-1980s and has since become a prolific and highly respected military historian with more than 20 books to his name. His work includes Master Bombers, Heroic Endeavour and A Pathfinder's War, and he's a regular contributor to publications such as Fly Past and Aeroplane Monthly. Sean's research has done a great deal to illuminate both the operational detail of the bombing war and the lived experience of Bomber Command aircrew. So Sean, welcome to Never Mind the Dam Busters. It's a real pleasure to have you with us.
Excellent. It's a pleasure to be here, although you have just made me feel old by talking about the 1980s.
Oh, don't worry, I was there then. Although I was still at school, if that might make you feel even older. But so today we are going to be focusing on one of the most strategically significant and morally complex operations of the air war, Bomber Command's raids on the German V-Weapons Research Centre at Peenemunde in August 1943. Now, these attacks were intended to disrupt weapons that posed a direct threat to Britain, but they also demanded unprecedented levels of precision and placed enormous pressure on the aircrews involved. Now, Sean, Peenemunde was never an ordinary target, was it? Can you explain why the German development of the V-weapons was such a concern for Allied leaders and why Bomber Command was tasked with attacking a site of such strategic and political importance?
Yes, indeed. The Germans have been experimenting with rockets since the 1920s. But in the 1930s, the whole sort of program began to become much more formalized. It was led by a man called Walter Dornberger, who was a military man and an engineer. But he was tasked with really driving the development of rockets from a military perspective, but because by that stage they'd obviously worked out that it had a sort of military aspect to it. And one of his acolytes was Wernher von Braun, who people will sort of know from the fact that he helped the Americans ultimately get to the moon. So he's one of the rising stars of the whole movement. They were building rockets. They were slowly getting there by way of the technologies, but they outgrew their existing establishment. And so they were looking for a new site, somewhere that was out of the way of prying eyes, somewhere that was large enough to experiment and sort of throw rockets around the sky and out to sea without causing any damage to anybody. And they happened upon the site at Peenemunde in the Baltic. And so they bought a tract of land and started building what was known as the military experimental station at Peenemünde in 1937. And so that's when no pun intended, that's when it really took off. They had a rocket called the A3, and the A simply stood for aggregate. It's just a sort of machine unit, as it were. And they had high hopes for this rocket, but it didn't quite perform in the way that they wanted. So concurrently, they'd been working on something called the A4. Now, the A4 is what you and our listeners will most likely think of when they think of rockets. So it's the V2. So if you think A4, think V2 and you're there. Now, this was a monster. This is 20 tons of thrust, carrying a 1-ton warhead, 160 miles. This is the stuff of terror. So they're developing this rocket, and all's going well. But actually, the war progressed to the point that Hitler decided that actually we don't particularly need rockets because everyone seemed to be sort of falling over quite quickly. But obviously Britain then held out, and he got a little bit more excited about things. And of course, with the bombing of Germany, he was very much focused, therefore, on getting one back. And so once again, there was a focus on developing this rocket, and it got to the stage where it was backed by the SS. So it achieved the highest sort of level of priority in terms of developing this weapon. And they started, the second prototype flew and seemed to be going well. It was getting to 16,000 feet. Then a third rocket had got to 35,000 feet and was flying at twice the speed of sound. And then they finally successfully tested a rocket, not until October 1942. So quite a few years of development to get there. But at that point, Albert Speer, on his recommendation, they decided to go into mass production of this weapon. And so the big plan was to produce up to 1,000 of these rockets every month. So this is now getting quite serious and quite scary. Now, concurrent to all of this, so that's being developed by the Wehrmacht, so the sort of the military, the army side. Concurrent to all this, the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, are developing their own pilotless bomb, which again we would know as the V1, officially the Fiesler 103, I believe it was, but it's effectively the V1. So they're developing the V1. You've got the V2 there or thereabouts and ready to go. They're also experimenting with the Messerschmitt, the 163, the rocket fighter. So there is all sorts of stuff going on at Peenemunde, which is frightening us. And they realise that if the rockets in particular, if the number that they're producing is converted into launches against the south of England, the fear is that not only would this create a blitz the like of which we hadn't experienced before, but it would potentially destroy any hopes of an invasion, because there was no defense against a weapon that effectively arrived and had basically exploded and done all its damage before you even heard it. So that was the real and very present danger, the clear and present danger, and that's why the task was given to Bomber Command to resolve it.
It is absolutely terrifying when you think about it, about the capability. I know we've all sort of heard about doodlebugs and things like that, but when you actually think about the reality of it, it is utterly terrifying, isn't it? Absolutely horrifying.
Yeah, and would have been ready to go much sooner had it not been for the interference of the Führer himself, which is quite interesting because when you look at the dates of when the invasion, etc., actually finally took place, if these rockets had been ready that much earlier, there could have been a very different outcome indeed.
Absolutely. So the decision to attack Peenemunde relied on a remarkable intelligence effort, didn't it? Sort of combining aerial reconnaissance, scientific analysis, code breaking, as well as human intelligence. How confident were the planners who were sort of planning operations on behalf of Bomber Command that they understood what was actually happening at the site? And how did that intelligence shape the planning of Operation Hydra?
Yeah, they were very confident, but it took a long time to get there. So we actually knew about what was going on at Peenemunde back in 1939. So that's when British intelligence were first made aware through the Norwegians in a report that was known subsequently as the Oslo Report. Now this apparently gave a tremendous amount of detail about what was going on, but there was almost so much detail, or there was so much detail, that it wasn't believed. It was actually believed that it must be fake. So it was almost sort of put on a shelf and forgotten about. And then it wasn't until another couple of years later that reports started coming out of Stockholm amongst engineers that were talking and conversations that were overheard that a new factory had been built for the production of secret weapons. But again, nothing immediately was done until 1943, when There's a famous incident of the generals, the German generals who were prisoners of war being kept in the sort of London cage, and their conversations were listened into. Absolutely right, listened into and recorded. And of course, they're talking, or one of them in particular is talking about secret weapons, and actually makes a point of saying that he's rather surprised that he hasn't heard any explosions during all of their stay in London, because surely the rocket attack should have started by now. So this was properly alarming at this point.
Yeah, absolutely.
So they no, so the British appoint a chap called Duncan Sandys, who's a member of Parliament. There's lots of interdepartmental nonsense going on at the time, and the sort of stuff that probably still happens today. But so they appointed Duncan Sandys to try and bring everyone together and coordinate a response. Now, he wasn't helped by Lord Cherwell, who you'll have come across from the Butt Report, because he was considered to be one of our greatest sort of scientists, and he was saying, well, there's no way the Germans have developed something to the extent that the intelligence is suggesting. So, of course, that was making people hesitate and more skeptical. So, if in doubt, send the RAF in is my motto. But there was one last bit of information that came out of Luxembourg, because some scientists and engineers from Luxembourg have been working at Peenemunde, and then for reasons best known to the Germans, they've been let home. So of course they were all talking. So this information all sort of came out, But it was decided that the best way of finding out what was really going on, or trying to piece this all together, was to send in the RAF and a photo reconnaissance squadron. So they sent basically 540 Squadron, who were flying Mosquitoes at the time. They went in, they did about 5 or 6 sorties over Peenemünde. And on one of those sorties, again, they found that you've got that very famous photograph of a rocket lying horizontally on a trailer, which was unmistakably a rocket and identified as such. And again, I think this was really alarming to the planners, but it was at that point that they absolutely understood the size, the scale of the site, the weapon that was being, or the key weapon that was being produced there, and that they understood that a conventional bombing attack, because of the size and scale of the attack, of the site, a conventional bombing attack wasn't going to work, and they needed to do a little bit of a rethink. So if bomber commands were going to take on the task, they couldn't just follow the usual tactics that they would follow against let's say, an ordinary target.
So that's what we'll come on to next then. So Operation Hydra differed significantly from routine area bombing raids, as you've said. So what made the planning for Peenemunde so distinctive, and in terms of the timing, deception, target marking and command? And what were the biggest dilemmas faced by those organising the operation, do you think?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, because the biggest problem that they had was, how are you going to destroy such a massive facility or cause as much destruction as possible at the first time of asking? Because not you're only going to get one go at this, but as soon as you've had one go at this, if you don't succeed, the Germans are simply going to move in defences to a level that it's then going to make it incredibly difficult to go back again or again and again and try and finish it off. So it was a case of, you had one proper go at this, and then the genie would be out of the bottle. But what is so different and what's so distinctive about this operation, therefore, was that because of the size of the area that they needed to attack, rather than just the one aiming point, which would be normal, there were actually 3 different aiming points across the entire facility. And the dilemma part that you hint at is because there was a very specific objective as part of this to actually kill people. So there was a specific objective to take out as many scientists and technicians. So it wasn't just about destroying buildings and infrastructure. It was actually about taking out people. And that there is a huge moral dilemma there if you think about that. So the three aiming points, the very first aiming point was actually the scientists themselves. So it was their housing estate. So it was where they lived. It was their living accommodation. That was one of the primary targets.
With their families, presumably.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. So they're not going to distinguish between the two. They need to take out, in their minds, the lot. And then they have the major workshops. I mean, these are vast. These are massive things. But that was the second aiming point. And the final aiming point were the development works themselves. So, and that was pretty much picked as well in order of priority. So this is a mammoth undertaking. It's going to involve 3 waves of bombers coming in over a 40-minute period. And what's going to happen is that they're going to have to shift the aiming point. So they're going to attack one of the aiming points first, and then when they're satisfied that they've done sufficient damage there, they're going to shift to the second point, and again repeat that process onto the third. So it is a huge undertaking. And in terms of the challenge, as it were, you've got the challenge of they're allocating 600, better part of 600 bombers. I think it's 597 if we're very specific, to the task. So that's 37 main force squadrons involved in this. This is a huge attack.
Wow.
And that doesn't include the 7 Pathfinder squadrons either. So your challenge is, how do you get that volume? How do you get that number of aircraft to the target on time, at an allotted time, when they've got to fly over the North Sea? So you're in the dark, it's over the North Sea, it's a hell of a trek, it's on the Baltic, it's apart from Berlin, it's the sort of place that no one really wants to go to because it's a long, cold flight. And there's always the danger of being intercepted along the way by the German night fighters, who we all know are really in their stride by the summer of 43. So you've got to get them there on time. Then when they're there, you've got to find a way of ushering them in and through in those different waves at the appointed time to cause the maximum disruption. So that's when they started looking at, well, what do we need that's different, which will take us on to the master bomber type role. And they also did some of the basics by way of a spoof. So they opted for to send a very small force, and when I say very small, I mean 8 aircraft to Berlin, Pathfinders, to make a noise over there in an attempt to draw the German night fighters away from the proper target, as it were.
So you've touched on the master bomber concept there, and this is certainly one of the key legacies of this raid, this refinement of the master bomber concept. Can you explain how this role worked in practice, Sean, and why it was so important on this raid in particular, and how it changed the way Bomber Command conducted complex operations in the future?
Yes. So you have to wind back slightly to the formation of Pathfinder Force in the first place. So there was the famous Butt report, which you've covered off previously, where we are literally missing targets by up to, well, normally sort of 3 to 5 miles, 1 in 15 bombers getting to within 3 to 5 miles. You're missing some targets by 70 miles. It was obvious we needed to do something about that. That ultimately led to the formation of a target marking force that was subsequently renamed Pathfinder Force in August 1942. And at that point, and a little bit before, but at that point, they start exploring the idea of using a master bomber. So someone who is going to control the entire raid. So it's great that you've got Pathfinders and you've got the best crews with the best aircraft and the best equipment leading every raid. But the raids are now getting to such a scale. They're so big compared to what had gone before that it's quite clear that you need greater control over what's going on. So a chap called Bill Anderson floated. He was a very well-known navigator. He floated the idea first at Bomber Command headquarters, but didn't really get much of a hearing. And then a chap called Pat Daniels, who's another very, very well-known bomber baron, he actually controlled a raid in December 42 and is in a way given credit for being Master Bomber #1 by the media, which is all quite interesting because no one's really heard of what he did. But the man who's officially given the title of the first Master Bomber to control a main force raid is John Searby. So he's our man for the Peenemunde raid. And Searby is an extremely experienced bomber commander. I mean, he's a former Halton apprentice. He was commanding officer at 106 Squadron. Then he took over at 83 Squadron on Pathfinder Force. He's what's called a Spec N as well, so he's a specialist navigator. So he really is the man of the moment, as it were. Now, his job as Master Bomber, and indeed the role of any Master Bomber, is fundamentally to ensure the highest concentration of bombs on the target. That's fundamentally what they are going to set out to achieve. Now, in a typical attack, a target would be illuminated. The visual markers would then drop target indicators, and the Master Bomber's role is then to assess how accurate those markers are. And if he's happy with those markers, he will call in main force to bomb and issue instructions accordingly. If he's not happy, he thinks that they need to be another marker put down. They'll put down another marker. So the first marker might be in yellow. He's not happy with it. He'll call in somebody, one of the other Pathfinders, to put down another marker. They'll use a different color, crucially, so maybe green. And then he'll assess what's going on and he'll say, yep, bomb the green marker, or he'll say overshoots the green marker by a second or 2 seconds or something. He is throughout the course of the raid controlling every element of it. And that'll include calling in the backers up. So the people who basically, once a marker's gone down, it only has a certain lifetime before you can't see it anymore. Yeah. So of course you have to bring which people do forget. You have to constantly keep remarking the target. And of course, every time you're marking a target, there is the risk of error again to be caught. So again, your Master Bomber is present throughout the entire raid. So as you can imagine, that is a very uncomfortable place to be when the duration of a raid could be 40 minutes, 45 minutes or more, and you as the Master Bomber have to be present throughout that entire attack. So it was incredibly experimental to use this on the Peenemunde raid, but it was a concept that I think everyone realized it was needed, but this was the first real opportunity to prove whether that concept was going to work. So it's sort of the way it changed things in the future was the fact that because it did work and because it was so successful, it put any of the doubters in the corner and it put all doubts to rest. So it was something that they returned to. Interestingly, they didn't sort of return to it immediately. It wasn't then every raid from then on in, but having proved that concept, they then applied the Master Bomber when it was appropriate again, sort of throughout the Battle of Berlin and beyond. And then after that period, every main force raid was always led by a Master Bomber. So you cannot underestimate how important Peenemunde was to the future operations of Bomber Command.
Yeah. Well, you've explained that beautifully, Sean. Thank you. So turning to the night itself then, the actual raid, 18th of August 43. How did the raid unfold from start to finish, and to what extent did Bomber Command actually achieve its immediate objectives? Where did things not go according to plan? Because there's always something goes wrong somewhere.
Something always goes wrong, doesn't it? Yeah, I mean, largely it went right. In fact, so John Searby arrived very much on time, which in itself is a remarkable feat of navigation, to go that far, to get that sort of distance with very primitive navigational aids. And he arrives first. He flies over the target. He's seen a model of the target beforehand, so now he's effectively committing. He's now visualizing in reality what he's seen in theory. So he's taking all of that information on board. He's very happy with what he sees. He flies a little bit out to sea, actually, and then comes across one of the first problems, which is a couple of flak ships there who sort of throw up a few bits and pieces, but he doesn't seem to be too bothered by them. He's very happy. The raid commences. The blind illuminators come. Now, just to explain that very briefly in case people don't know what we're talking about. So anything when they use the word blind in Pathfinder parlance means that they are using equipment. So rather than being able to visually see something. Yeah. So blind is effectively using H2S, the ground scanning radar. And that's giving them a picture on the screens in the aircraft, so they know within a very good degree of accuracy when they're over the target by way of then dropping the markers or dropping the illuminations to begin with. That illuminates the target. Then the real stars of the show, other than the master bomber, come into play. So these are the sort of the primary visual markers. As I say, these are your proper first 11. They're coming in now. They've got the specialist air bombers on board. They're the first people to mark the target. Now, actually, this is one of the first things that goes a little bit awry, because one of the first markers drops a mile and a half short, and very unfortunately, it lands on the accommodation where a lot of the slave labour or the forced labour is being kept, with quite disastrous results, unfortunately. Now, that is very quickly put right. It's realised very soon. It's remarked, and then the attack begins in earnest, and the first wave comes in. The first wave is probably the most successful, because by that point, although the Germans are trying to put up smoke screen and what have you, it's still pretty clear what they're bombing. So the air bombers who are coming in have got a pretty good sighting of what's below. As the raid progresses, obviously with the destruction and devastation, it becomes a little bit more difficult to discern what's actually beneath you. But the shift from the first aiming point to the second aiming point goes very well. All goes according to plan. And they mark and they start bombing then. And the shift from the second to the third isn't quite so successful. Again, largely for the reasons I've already explained. I mean, there's a lot of chaos going on below there, and it takes Searby a little while to work out that one of the green markers, which he's insisting everyone should bomb, is in fact a little bit not on target, as it were. So again, he puts that right. You've also got about halfway through the second wave attack, the German night fighters finally arrive. They have been spoofed. The Mosquitoes have done a stunning job. They have all wandered off to Berlin, but they realise that they've been had. And as I say, just as the second wave is ending, the third wave is coming in. That's when the Germans really strike. The night fighters really strike. So in terms of what went according to plan, I mean, when Searby got back, he was pretty much accosted by Duncan Sandys, who was waiting for him and wanted to know how it went. And Searby was confident at that point that the raid had gone well. He knew the raid had gone well from a control perspective. He just couldn't confirm whether the amount of destruction that he thought he was seeing was actually right until further intelligence had been gathered. But one of the things that had gone wrong was they were using an island just off the coast, the island of Ruden, as a sort of marking point. So they would do a timed run from the island to the aiming point.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, they couldn't pick up this island as well as they thought they were going to, because H2S was usually really good at discerning coastline from, discerning water from land. So it was brilliant at coastlines. But for reasons that aren't quite clearly explained, it wasn't picked up very well, and that clearly affected the marking. But when you looked at the raw facts in terms of, did it meet its immediate objectives, the first report that came out basically showed that of the 597 aircraft that had been dispatched, 531 of those had bombed. Again, that might come as a surprise to people, how many aircraft actually never get to bomb, which is always quite an interesting one.
Yeah, there's always quite a few, isn't
20,
there?
There's often more than you realise, yeah. So 23 actually aborted, half a dozen or so actually bombed alternative targets, and then we get to the point which we'll discuss shortly, 40 of our aircraft failed to return.
So I would like to focus now on the men flying the operation, the most important sort of cogs in the wheel, if you like. So from long over water routes, which you've touched on before, having to sort of come down into the Baltic, and navigation challenges, the flak fighters and the pressure of flying a high sort of precision attack. What do we know from aircrew accounts what it was like to take part in the Peenemunde raid? Yeah,
that's a great question, Most of those taking part were not told what the target was. So most of the crews did not know what the real purpose of Peenemunde was. They were led to believe and not sort of dissuaded of the belief that it was some sort of radar establishment, and that radar was used to help control night fighters and the like. So they were therefore very well up for this, by way of they realised this was an important target, or believed this was an important target. I mean, even to the point where Bruin Boyce, who was an air commodore who was on Donald Bennett's staff, the Pathfinder Supremo, he went along because he just sensed it was something special. So he decided to hitch a lift and go along. So we know that the aircrew were concerned that the raid was being made during a full moon period, which you will know, Jane. Yeah. It was usually a period when Bomber Command, didn't operate for obvious reasons. You could too easily be seen and picked off in a full moon. There was, as you say, there was concern at the distance that they needed to travel. I mean, the Baltic is a long way from home, and a trip or 7 hours or more of it, and most of that routed across the sea, they were never popular. So we know that it wasn't a popular destination, shall we say. We also know that by 1943, as I've touched on earlier, the German night fighter defences, they were already greatly feared. They were so in their stride, and so it was crucial this spoof worked, and it did work, but only for a period of time. So it was also the first use, which is an interesting one from a historic perspective. It was the first use of Schräger music, so the upward-firing cannon that the German night fighters. Yeah. So this was the first time this had been used, and in fact, 6 of the 40 aircraft that were lost were believed to be victims to this new method of attack. And of course, these aircraft which are suddenly blown out of the sky when you didn't see a fighter, that ultimately led to all of these mysteries around things like scarecrows, which didn't exist. But why else? Yeah, absolutely. Why else would an aircraft just explode mysteriously? So, and until such time as that was explained, that was a real fear and amongst a Bomber Command crews, as you know. So, if you talk to aircrew, as I was fortunate to have done over the years, you'll find that those who were in the first and second wave will have a very different view of Peenemunde and the attack than those in the in the third wave, so those from 5 Group and 6 Group, because they were the ones who caught the brunt of the night fighters. So I just captured two particular quotes. So there was a quote from one of the aircrew from the first wave, whose view of Peenemunde was simply that it was just another job well done. Now compare that to how an aircrew member in a 5 Group crew summarised the raid, and he said it was a night out for the German fighters. So it's a really interesting contrast. What I would say, though, is that whether you're in the first, second or third wave, everyone I've ever spoken to, and every account, or pretty much every account I've ever read, there is enormous pride in those aircrew who took part in the Peenemunde raid. So if you interviewed them, they might mention this raid, they might mention that raid, but if they were on Peenemunde, they would always mention it. So it was always worn as a sort of a badge of pride by those aircrew who took part.
Now, Bomber Command losses were extremely high in 1943. It's a period that I've studied in some depth myself, and Peenemunde was no exception. So how heavy were the losses on this operation, Sean, and how should we understand those casualties? I'm thinking both among aircrew and also among the civilians and forced labourers on the ground, because sometimes we tend not to focus on those, and I really think that we should. So how do we sort of fit that in when assessing the raid's overall impact?
Yeah, so there were 40 aircraft lost from the Peenemünde raid. There was also the one Mosquito lost from the spoof. So 40 is 6.7% of the attacking force. Now, I know percentages. I know some people get very upset by percentages, but it was the official way of actually monitoring Bomber Command losses at the time. Or at that time anyway. So it's interesting to look at 40 and think, okay, well, how did that compare to other raids that were going on at the time? And if you look at comparable attacks in terms of volume, so if you look at a raid on Berlin the following week, their loss rate was 7.9%. So, another whole percentage point more than that. If you look at the Leipzig attack 6 months later, which was the loss rate was 9.5%. And that was considered appalling and only bettered, even though bettered is obviously the worst word possible, but that was bettered by Nuremberg at 11.9%. So if you think of 6.7% compared to 11.9%, actually that's an interesting comparison, because Harris's view was that the loss rate at Peenemunde was not only an acceptable loss rate. Again, that's a dreadful word, but that's how he phrased it. But it was actually a smaller loss rate than he thought. So he actually expected to lose more aircraft than they did. But again, it's really interesting, and you made me do some homework here. So I looked into the specific numbers of within those 40. And if we think again about a first wave, second wave, and third wave, and the majority being lost in the third wave, 5 Group actually lost 14.5% of its contribution, which is huge.
Isn't it? Yeah.
And 6 Group lost 19.7%. They lost nearly 1 in 5 aircraft. Yeah. So there we go. So sometimes it is horrific. So sometimes you can look at a bald figure like 40 and think, oh, well, that's not so bad in the greater scheme of things. And then you look at a particular element of it when the night fighters arrive. So God forbid what might have happened had the Germans actually worked and not been spoofed, not been fooled, and got there earlier. Now, you ask as part of your question, how should we view some of those figures? And we'll come to the civilian casualties in a minute. But how do you view those figures? Well, what was interesting was that the group commanders of 1 Group, 3 Group, 5 Group, etc., they were ordered to ensure that their squadrons were led by their most experienced crews. Now, that's all fine and dandy until it starts going wrong. And actually, there were 3 squadron commanders lost. So the CO of 426 Squadron, the CO of 57 Squadron, and the CO of 619 Squadron all lost. And so that's 3 wing commanders all gone. You've also got half a dozen squadron leaders and/or flight commanders gone. So you've got experience there that is incredibly difficult to replace. So sometimes it's not just about the number, although the number is always the impressive thing, as it were. Sometimes it's more important to look at the caliber of the men that were lost on that raid, and we did lose some incredibly experienced men on the trip. Then we come to this thorny issue of the civilian casualties, because now I think it's important we almost sort of separate this out into 2 different things, because there were around about 700 that were killed, and that sort of breaks down into approximately 180 or so sort of Germans in its broadest sense, and then 500 or 600 or so foreign workers. And I'm very aware that these are huge generalities, but that's mainly how they're described in the reports. Now, one of the objectives, and I shall read this to you because it's extraordinary, was to kill or incapacitate as many of the scientific and technical personnel possible. That was actually a stated objective. So the targeting of the German scientists being intentional, when you talk about how do we assess the impact, you would have to say, therefore, that was very successful. I know that sounds really grim, doesn't it? But you would have to say that was therefore success. If we were to think about the foreign workers, they were killed by mistake. That was a tragedy. That was a regrettable sadness, as somebody once said. Again, though, if you're being very, very brutal, you might say, well, that's 500 or 600 workers that have to be found from somewhere else. They still need to be replaced. So at some point, that is disrupting both what's happening at Peenemunde, and it has to have an impact, therefore, on other projects where the Germans require labour in such large numbers.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of looking at it. Yeah, from a sort of a purely almost economic point of view, isn't it? Yeah, brutal, as you say, but yeah, interesting.
It is grim. It is brutal. It is brutal.
Yeah. So there's been a long-running debate then about the effectiveness of the Peenemunde raid. There's always a long-running debate about everything to do with Bomber Command. But from your research, what was its short and long-term impact on the V1 and V2 programs? And how significant do you think the contribution was that was made by Bomber Command and the Bomber Command crews?
Yeah. Searby, immediately after the raid, was pretty comfortable that the place had been destroyed. He didn't think it could have gone much better. So that was his contemporary view at the time. History tells us, if we look at, say, the Strategic Air Offensive against Germany, so Webster and Franklin's book, they'll argue that although there was a huge amount of damage done, we missed some of the more important parts of Peenemunde. They say, for example, that the research and development area, so pretty much the third target, the third aiming point, didn't receive the amount of damage that was originally intended, and certainly people thought that they'd achieved. So therefore, it did well, and some of the figures by way of the numbers of buildings destroyed, etc., and the percentage of the infrastructure destroyed look impressive on paper, but perhaps we didn't hit some of the really crucial bits, which meant that they could get back to producing these rockets quite swiftly afterwards. Now, This is where you run into all sorts of problems. I have seen estimates from sort of 4 to 6 weeks through to sort of 3 months or so by way of the impact to production. Now, I don't think they're necessarily the most helpful figures, because I can think, and I'm sure you will know, about raids on Krupps, which basically continue throughout the war right till April 1945, and yet Krups was still managing to produce arms, weapons, etc., right till the end. So whether a facility was able to produce something or not, and how quickly they were able to get back to production, is only one part of the question when you're looking at how successful or otherwise was this attack. I think one of the major successes of this raid was that it scared the Germans. It made something that they believed was sort of untouchable, touchable. And as a result of scaring them, but as a result of reaching out and actually getting them, it meant that they had to look at transferring some of the production out. So it meant that they looked at producing things in the Harz Mountains, which is exactly what they did. So they shifted some of the production away from Peenemünde to different areas. Now, again, there are no published statistics or what have you, but common sense will tell you that any shift of men, material, resources, etc., from one facility to another has to be disruptive, has to cost money, has to use precious time and resources when neither are in good supply, or both are in short supply, should I say. You've also got, quite interestingly, there in amongst those 180 Germans that were killed, there were two very important rocket scientists who were killed, and one of whom, a chap called Dr. Thiel, he was a propulsion specialist, and he'd been working on a sort of anti-aircraft rocket program. Well, with his death came the end of that program. That never saw fruition. He was also working on a two-stage rocket, and similarly, that project never came into being. So you have to look at the quality of some of the people who were impacted by the raid. Look, it's important to say that the rockets did come. Yeah. They did arrive. They were sent over, but it wasn't until September 1944. And crucially, so if we think that if that attack put back production, even if you looked at that raw figure of saying it put back production by 8 weeks or 12 weeks, you are still therefore at a sort of time and place where the invasion should not have been impacted by it. And certainly, although Harris was really, really clear that he never expected a single attack to wipe out the entire facility. He said that, he wrote that. But he also wrote, in the war of the V-weapons, time was everything, and every delay we could cause the enemy, however brief, was thoroughly worthwhile. And I also read that Eisenhower wrote in his book, and I think this is really telling, and I'm surprised others haven't picked up on this, actually. Eisenhower, in his book Crusade in Europe, he suggests that without the attack on Peenemunde, then it would have made the invasion, in his words, exceedingly difficult and perhaps even impossible.
Yeah, that's big. That's big, isn't it? Yeah, that's very, very impressive. So lots of food for thought.
None of that could have been done without the boys of Bomber Command.
Yeah. How do you think the Peenemunde raid is remembered today, Sean? Sort of both within RAF history and in the wider public memory of the war. And what does that tell us about the balance between innovation, aircrew sacrifice, and the moral complexities of the bombing war?
I think, unfortunately, I think Peenemunde is actually largely forgotten. I don't think it's something that is in the British psyche at all. I think, look, part of that is going to be because after the war, Peenemunde fell behind the Iron Curtain. Yes, the airfield and its surroundings were used to test. Yeah, so therefore, it sort of wasn't there. It wasn't something that was then photographed and celebrated and written about, because it was, as I say, it was in Russian hands. And I know, for example, I wrote a book a few years back about some of the sort of lost graves of Peenemunde, and the British Missing Research and Inquiry Units and their US counterparts, they went in to try and recover some of the bodies that were lost in the raid in August and a subsequent US raid, and they were just hampered all the way along the line. I mean, they were just the Russians just were typically awkward at every stage. So again, that didn't really help matters. I think for those who do know something about Peenemunde, I think there's a general sort of, that must be the rocket place, which is something, I guess. Obviously, there was the cracking film with George Peppard and co. On Operation Crossbow. Which
I was just watching that the other day. It's on BBC iPlayer at the moment, I think. Yeah.
Which it sort of hints at a sort of it's a Peenemunde-esque type film, isn't it? So, so that there's that a little bit, I guess. I think your problem is that Peenemunde as well, with so many other things that Bomber Commands, which you've hinted at on previous podcasts, and we've talked about before, is that that the death of the slave labours, the forced labour, for example, tends to sort of dominate anything that is written by the mainstream media about Peenemunde, in the same way it does on Dresden, for example. Yeah. It tends to be the focus is on the 500 or 600 who were killed in the tragedy of Peenemunde, rather than understanding the requirements of the raid, the objectives of the raid, what it achieved, and completely misses the point of just how many people would have been killed had those rockets been ready and available and fired earlier. Because as it was, I think 5,000 or so British civilians were killed by the rockets. I think. Yeah, it's quite a lot. And I think 2,500 arrived, so it wasn't a small number. So if you wind that clock back, I think we could have been in a right old pickle, to be honest. So it should be remembered as a raid where it demonstrated a feat of airmanship by the master bomber, so John Searby in particular, the Pathfinders as well, and indeed all of the main force crews. It should be really celebrated by the Royal Air Force as being one of their finest hours. I don't think it is in the sense that I don't think they do celebrate it, but I think it should be. I think it's really underestimated, underrepresented, and largely sort of misunderstood as an attack. And it should also be, as I've written about previously, it should be remembered as the vindication of the need for and the benefits of having a master bomber, which therefore went on to further improve the accuracy of future bombing attacks on Bomber Command, and therefore eventually bring around the destruction and the surrender of the Germans and the Axis.
I think that's one of the things that we try to bring out on this podcast, and certainly in some of our previous episodes, is that you've got to see the bigger picture. I think our view of history becomes increasingly narrow, doesn't it, down the decades? And there's always a bigger picture. Like I've explored with my work on mine laying, gardening operations. We tend to see things as like one individual raid or one individual campaign or whatever, but you can't. It's all part of this massive whole, and I think that so often gets forgotten. But I think that summary that you've just provided there absolutely pinpoints why the Peenemunde raid is so important and why it should be so well remembered. So, Sean, thank you so much for joining us.
And it does.
Yep, go on. Yep.
No, I was mindful about your point about the balance between innovation, aircrew sacrifice, etc. And I was merely going to add that it should also be remembered as operation that did indeed join up intelligence with technology, with new tactics and strategic thinking, with raw courage to achieve the results that it achieved.
Yeah, that's an excellent summary. Sean, that's been absolutely fantastic. I've really enjoyed this discussion. It's been brilliant, and I'm sure our listeners will absolutely love it too. I think Peenemunde sits at the intersection of intelligence, technology, strategy, but above all, it does remind us of the immense demands placed on Bomber Command aircrews and the horrendous losses that they sustained. So your insights have helped us understand not just what happened, but also what it cost. And I would also like to mention it at this point, your own podcast, Sean. Do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about that? And I'll put the link in the show notes so that people can check it out as well.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Yes, it's called the Fighting High podcast, which I'm doing with a fellow author and publisher, Steve Darlow. And we've simply accumulated so much information by way of interviews with veterans from over the last 20, 25 years or so, from all elements of the fighting war, as it were, in the air. So it's just launched. So it's very exciting. And I have no doubts that Jane will be speaking on our own podcast very shortly.
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you. That's something to look forward to. So thank you, as always, to everyone who's been listening today and who listens all the time. We've got listeners now, I think, in 127 countries, which is just absolutely mad. So if you've been enjoying Nevermind the Dam Busters, please consider leaving us a rating or review on your favourite podcast app. It really does help others find the show. If you'd like to support the podcast further, you can do so for as little as £2.40 or $3 a month. Details are in the show notes. Coming up next, I'm going to be joined by Professor Alan Allport, friend of the show, as they say, who'll be talking about his new book, Advanced Britannia, and what it reveals about Britain, war, and how the conflict has been remembered and understood. You can also join the conversation in our Facebook group or connect with us across social media. So we'll be back again next week with a brand new episode. So until then, take care and goodbye.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.